We welcome Nick Delatorre of Gators Online, the world's largest outdoor cocktail party happening in Jacksonville this weekend. This is a potential season maker for the Gators, Nick. They're coming off a bye week. They had what appears to be an offensive renaissance against South Carolina. We'll get to the defense later. But how are the Gators coaches and players feeling heading into this one?
Yeah, I think there's always going to be confidence, whether there's stats or real things to back it up. But no football team goes into a Saturday thinking they're going to lose. I think Georgia not having Brock Bowers is significant. Now, listen, Brock Bowers doesn't play defense, and Florida's going to still have to figure out how to move the football and score points. But there's definitely confidence with Florida. I think the bye week came at a great time, just in terms of getting guys healthy. And then certainly, listen, Florida didn't just start looking at Georgia film. This is stuff you watch in the summer, in the fall, during fall camp. So Florida's been getting ready for this game probably for 364 days.
Kirby Smart said something interesting in his press conference on Monday. He said he feels like Florida's played its best football in the last two games. Mm-hmm. And, you know, it's interesting because you look at what Florida did, especially offensively against South Carolina. It feels like they've discovered some new things, or kind of just like, I'll give you an example. Trey Wilson, freshman receiver, got hurt against Tennessee. Clearly was a big part of that game plan, but got hurt, missed a little bit more time. It feels like he's kind of back in the flow of the offense now and becomes a more legitimate weapon.
Georgia has had some struggles setting the edge. And listen, whenever you talk about Georgia having struggles, it's in the prism of Georgia has won 30-something straight SEC games, hasn't lost a regular season game since 2020. So it's a different prism than a lot of other teams are looking at.
Struggle is where we're using air quotes.
Right. Yeah. So they've had some trouble setting the edge. And when I look at that, I think, well, Trey Wilson's run an actual ultra marathon in pre-snap motion. He's a guy who, when Kirby Smart was asked about Graham Mertz, made a point to talk about Trey Wilson because he's a guy who gets skinny, misses tackles. They will run the ball with him. They'll put him in the backfield and run counters with him. And the biggest thing for Trey is Florida doesn't have a ton of playmakers. You've got two good running backs, Ricky Pearsall, and that was it. And teams could then just focus on stopping the run and take Ricky out of the game. Now with Arlis Boardingham coming into his own and him emerging and Trey Wilson being back and healthy, Florida has other options. So that helps create for Ricky Pearsall. I go back to 2020, Andy, when Kyle Pitts was knocked out of the Georgia game. Kadarius Toney didn't look like Kadarius Toney those next couple of games because you were able to focus on him if you're a defensive coordinator. So it's not just Eugene Wilson or just Ricky Pearsall. I think it's the totality of those three players that really gives Florida an advantage offensively.
We'll get right back into the midst of the world's largest outdoor cocktail party. But first, I want to talk about some gear you can wear to any outdoor cocktail party. And that's Rhoback, made for performance, made for this time of year. The performance hoodie is the best fall garment. It's really the best spring garment too. Depending on how breezy it is, the best summer garment. It is absolutely the most comfortable thing I own. And now I own 5 different colors, and I'm hoping to just complete the set. But Rhoback makes performance Q-zips, hoodies, polos, shorts, joggers, and now the performance crew, which is also great for the fall when you want to look a little more polished, but you also want to have some cocktails. RHOBACK.com. Use the promo code STAPLES and you get 20% off your first order. So that's Rhoback.com. Use the promo code STAPLES, 20% off your first order. That's what it was interesting, because somebody had asked Kirby a question about Ricky Pearsall and why he's been so good. And at first I thought Kirby was throwing shade because he's like, availability. He's been healthy. He's been playing the whole time. But what he was saying is they haven't been at full strength. Mm-hmm. They are more dangerous at full strength. And he's legitimately worried about that, which and the other piece of this is Graham Mertz. They turned him loose against South Carolina. It feels like they kind of had to, because Florida's defense was not stopping South Carolina's offense. but did they also discover something in the process?
I think potentially, and it probably goes to having those three guys healthy and involved. But I think you and I were talking last week, and it might be how Florida has to play to win games. When you look at Arkansas and Florida State at LSU, good luck in that track marathon or that track meet. I think you did discover something. Listen, I didn't think a big question. If I was a highly paid defensive coordinator, not trying to get fired to collect my buyout, I would have gone into a game against Florida saying, if Graham Mertz beats us with his arm, that's fine. But we're going to stop the running game. We're going to limit Ricky Pearsall. And if Graham Mertz wins a game on his arm, we can live with that. But now he's showing you that he can. Florida's down 10 on the road at South Carolina, and he leads 2 scoring drives. So Graham Mertz is now shown, put on film, I can lead a team with my arm. So, yeah, I think Florida has discovered something. Do I think that they're the LSU offense? No.
Yeah. Let's flip it around. Florida's defense against this Georgia offense minus Brock Bowers. Now, the question I think probably is, what is Georgia's offense minus Brock Bowers? Do they play the freshman Lawson Lucky more and just make Oscar Delp the number 1 tight end so it looks somewhat similar with a lot of 12 personnel? Or do they say, we're going to go with Delp because he's older and just have another receiver on the field, which they got some pretty good receivers too.
You mean they've recruited well in Athens?
They've portaled and recruited well.
Okay.
I'd say Ladd McConkey is a great recruiting victory, and Ra Thomas and Dominic Lovick are great portal victories.
Yeah, it seems like every week we're going to have Austin Armstrong's biggest test when you start looking at the rest of the schedule. But it's kind of a great unknown. What is Georgia without Brock Bowers? It's going to affect their running game. It's going to affect their passing game. Carson Beck had a nice, warm, heavy safety blanket to wrap himself up in at night. So that's gone. Who is your outlet guy now? Who's your go-to guy now? So there's gonna be a ton of questions. Florida doesn't wish Brock Bowers was playing this game, but now I think there's more unknowns of, okay, well, how is Georgia going to attack us? So Austin Armstrong's probably sitting here having the same discussion that we are, Andy, like, hey, what do they do? Who do we need to be ready for now?
Yeah, that's the tricky part. Is it just more Dominic Lovett and Ra Thomas? And McConkey had been hurt, so he's just now getting back into the flow of things too. So yeah, I can imagine Georgia, running those guys on drag routes, trying to make Florida chase, trying to make Florida tackle, because that has been an issue for Florida of late.
They tackle really well at home. Really well at home.
This is only half home. This is it's 70 miles away, but it's half Georgia fans in the crowd. So
so they'll have a half bad tackling game, a half good tackling game, depending on how you want to view the glass. But that is going to be a thing. Like, I think for Florida to win this game, for Florida to be competitive in this game, they're going to have to play near perfect. You can't have penalties. You can't turn the ball over. If you've got on third down a tackle behind the sticks, you can't miss that and let Georgia get a first down. You have to play a sound game of football. And then something Florida hasn't really been good at, you're going to probably have to create turnovers. Yeah. You might have to have a game-changing play from your game changers. So there's so many facets of this game that Florida has to play their A-plus game at to have a chance. And they haven't really played their A-plus game away from Ben Hill Griffin Stadium.
Yeah, and that's the interesting thing, because this Georgia team doesn't feel like the last two. Like the last two, Florida goes into that game, there's no shot. This one, if they get the Georgia that played Auburn, there's a chance. And I think that feels like the biggest difference this year.
It's interesting because Florida fans and our message board have been pointing at, well, they were losing to South Carolina. Vanderbilt scored 20. Look at the Auburn game. And I can talk away South Carolina and Vanderbilt by saying, listen, Georgia just is like, hey, roll the ball out where Georgia will win. But that Auburn game, that's the South's oldest rivalry. Like, that's a rivalry game just like Florida-Georgia is. So I always say there's so many ex-Georgia players on that coaching staff. This game is intensely personal for many on that staff, probably former Florida head coach.
I was going to say, there's a fired Florida head coach who was a Georgia player. Yeah.
And a lot of those guys did not have success as players against Florida. So they revel in beating Florida even more now. And I don't know that, Florida has that on their coaching staff or that you necessarily need that to be a great
Well,
coach.
they brought it in. They brought in a guy who, as a player, had very little success against Georgia. And then when he became the coach, he had a lot of success against Georgia. They brought in Steve Spurrier to kind of educate the guys on the rivalry, which there's probably not a better person for that.
Yeah. I think he probably told them, well, guys, we hung half 100 up there in Athens. But yeah, I think it's intensely personal. So I told Florida fans, like, hey, if you think you're going to get sleepy Georgia at 3:30 that you saw against South Carolina, I got a bridge in Brooklyn to sell you. Like, that's not going to be the Georgia that you're going to get. Georgia will be ready for any time Florida's on the other sideline.
Yeah, and that's the part I'm curious about, because if they get the full strength version of Georgia, the version that played against Kentucky, that's a bad sign for Florida. But how Florida performs in this game, again, we've talked, I've talked about this a bunch. I went on your podcast, Dave and Gale, last week, and we were talking about Florida's young players and what they're doing in terms of volume, how many of them are playing, how big of an impact they're making. It does feel like they're trending in the right direction on that front.
But it's the difference between rebuilding, which you took it down to the concrete foundation, versus reloading.
Right.
So yes, I don't think Florida is ready to beat Georgia this year. I'm super encouraged by Eugene Wilson, Jordan Castell, TJ Searcy, Kelby Collins, Eugene Wilson. Like, there's a long list of freshmen. And for Florida, looking at 2024, you're bringing all these guys back. This is going to be the first taste for those guys, those freshmen, redshirt freshmen, who will be a huge part of your team next year. Their first taste of Florida, Georgia. Hey, this is what this rivalry feels like. And it's going to be, it's not different, like a Tennessee rivalry. You're going back and forth, home and home. This is going to be the exact same environment you'll have next year as well. So this is a huge grow up moment and learning moment for those Florida freshmen who are being asked to do a lot right now, but will be asked to do even more in the following season. Yeah.
And I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about LJ McCrae and what his commitment means. He's Daytona Beach Mainland High School, committed to Florida over the weekend, top 100 player, one of the best defensive linemen in the recruiting class. How big is that?
On which front? One, it's huge because he's 6'6", 275, an edge player, a guy who Florida's already playing 2 freshman defensive linemen this year. There's no problem. Billy Napier and his staff have no problem playing guys young. And I think LJ McCrae is a guy who can come in and play as a freshman. At that size, do you stay on the edge where they're recruiting him right now? Does he develop into, a 3 technique? Who cares as long as he's in orange and blue? But the bigger thing to me, even more so than him as a player, is you beat Georgia, you beat Florida State. And if you're rebuilding and you want to be where Georgia is, where the school out west is, ranked number 4 right now, these are the teams you have to beat and the players you have to beat those teams for.
Yeah, and that's like, you look at Florida's defense now. Who did they beat Georgia for? Who plays for them now? Shamar James, for sure. Kelby Collins, I believe, was one that Georgia wanted, but it's not a long list. And you have to increase that list. It's the same reason. Like, Georgia got good because they beat out Alabama and Clemson for players. And this is the difference, I think, between Florida now and Florida under Dan Mullen, was they are winning some of those, but the problem is those don't pay immediate dividends. That has to marinate for a little while.
Yeah, you'd have to take Mike Norvell's portal strategy to have those immediate dividends. But like, I look at Florida in the portal, and fans didn't like, I think more specifically the spring portal, but Ricky Pearsall was in the portal. You're starting right tackle, you're starting right guard, your quarterback, you're starting running back. You've got 2 linebackers from the portal. Like, Florida has had success in the portal. Maybe just not a Keon Coleman type.
Right. They haven't gotten a Keon Coleman or a Jared Verse, and that's kind of the next step. And it's interesting, and we can definitely talk about that as they go forward, because they do need to make a big splash or 2 from the portal to add to the people they're bringing in from high school.
Well, when you look at the recruiting class, Florida needs offensive line help. There's not a great offensive tackle market in the portal. When those big
No.
5-stars who end up being first-round picks get to a school, they typically just stay there for 3
Very
years.
loyal. It's hard to make the big men move. Like they don't like packing up their stuff.
That's a lot of stuff.
Yeah,
Exactly. That's a double XL T-shirt. Those take up a lot of room in a
Yeah.
suitcase. Andy, don't want to keep moving those.
Yep, exactly. So, well, I'm fascinated to see where this goes from here, but I'm fascinated in this game because, again, Florida seems to be getting a little bit better, and we just don't know what version of Georgia shows up from week to week. So, we'll see you in Jacksonville, Nick.
See you at the world's largest outdoor cocktail party.
That's right. Thank you so much for watching. Just a reminder, subscribe to this channel right here so you never miss an episode of Andy Staples on 3. And oh, by the way, watch all the other great videos on the On3 Sports YouTube channel.